I was born in the 70s, and at that time, if you look back historically, it was an exciting time then, because at that unique era in history, that this was about 30, 40 years after we had all just been killing each other in World War II. And at that particular juncture, all these nations that were, not that long ago fighting and killing each other came together to plan the International Space Station. That's really a remarkable achievement, if nothing, even obviously from an engineering point of view, but also from a political point of view, that these countries and nations that we came together and said, this is more important than us fighting over petty politics. So it's a remarkable time. And the ISS came out of that. It's research into how the human body reacts in zero gravity came out of that. But, it's also taken a long time, and it's to no one's discredit. It's just the nature of a complex arrangement like that, and political entities, they are going to move slow. But, now we have that kind of bedrock upon which to sit to start to think about humanity's next steps in space. What's the future for us? Colonization of orbit, colonization of moon, of Mars. These things are all going to happen in our lifetime.
Welcome to Fringe FM, the podcast that explores the edges of human understanding and looks at the technologies, trends, and societal norms shaping our collective future. Here, the world's top minds share their insights and predictions on the convergence, direction, and ethics of exponential technologies transforming life as we know it. You can learn more and stay up to date at fringe.fm. What did you dream of becoming as a kid? I bet for a lot of you, astronaut was high up there on the list. What could be cooler? Putting on the suit, going into space, going where no man, woman, or child has gone before. One small step, right? Well, today we've got someone who's in that vein, but doing something almost cooler, almost much cooler, in fact. Today we've got Frank Bunger on the line. Frank's a veteran tech exec, serial entrepreneur, and the founder and CEO of Orion Span, a startup that's building a space hotel, literally, the second space station, 200 miles above Earth, and letting individuals, 6 at a time, go to Aurora Station, spend $790,000 a night, and have one of the coolest experiences of their life. It's incredibly interesting and something that Frank got into because he realized he couldn't make it as an astronaut. With his previous tech experience, he thought, you know what? Space looks interesting. Let's look into this. So he did. In today's program, we're going to discuss the future of interstellar travel, why now is the time for space tech startups, how Frank's company plans to put a profitable hotel in orbit profitably, the biggest problem of putting people into space, why we're still more than a few years off from a moon or Mars colony, the importance of sci-fi and technology and invention, how the shift from public to private space companies is transforming the industry, the effects of ownership in asteroid mining in space, Frank's thoughts on evolution as we move into space, the reason Frank views space exploration as merely amplified globalization, and the awesome effects of space technology on the rest of the economy. And now, without further ado, I give you Frank Bunger. Just a quick warning, I want to apologize for some of the parts of Frank's audio. There are some parts where it does cut in and out and he sounds a little bit like Arnold from the Terminator. But you're still able to get the entirety of what's going on and follow a really, really fascinating conversation. It was incredible talking with Frank. I'm glad he was able to lend us time out of his busy day to chit-chat about the future of space travel technology and where we're headed as a society. Now, obviously, there's a couple of challenges, but I know you will enjoy this podcast. So, again, I give you Frank Bunger.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I think it's very relevant. What did you dream of becoming when you were a kid?
I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid, and I'm probably not alone in that dream, but I was also one of those kids that got horribly motion sick just driving down the street to Safeway. So I realized early on that a career into the Air Force and test pilot and that tried and true path probably wasn't going to work out for me. So I largely shelved my interest in space until just recently. When I reapproached the business in the last few years, I started to think, how could I apply all the skills I learned as an entrepreneur, as a startup executive, and my experience in Silicon Valley to bear on the space business to make things move faster, more efficiently, and more leanly than has typically been done in aerospace.
Has it been inefficient just because it's been primarily government driven before SpaceX?
Yeah, to some degree. So I think the biggest kind of legacy challenge in the business is that government contracts have been going to large aerospace companies, and those companies don't have any motivation to control cost because they charge cost plus, meaning they come up with a cost and they add 30% for their profit margin. So there's actually a perverse incentive to increase cost rather than reduce cost, because the more that you increase cost, the bigger your 30% is in dollar amount. So I think we started to see that start to reverse with players like I think you really have to credit SpaceX as being the first player to really reverse that to some degree and start to drive cost out of the system. And now that we're starting to see more and more, not just launch startups, but a plethora of space startups that are largely focused on the same thing, using trends like commoditization of hardware, cheaper, better, faster computer hardware, and the also cheaper launch costs over time to take advantage of that and create a similar bloom in technology and capabilities that we've also seen in the technology business in the last 10 to 15 years.
And so you decide to get into this because you would have been a failure as an astronaut, but you're a solid entrepreneur.
I guess you could summarize it that way. I think more broadly speaking, this has always been a huge passion of mine. And what I feel is that I was born in the 70s. And at that time, if you look back historically, it was an exciting time then, because at that unique era in history, this was about 30, 40 years after we had all just been killing each other in World War II. And at that particular juncture, all these nations that were, not that long ago fighting and killing each other came together to plan the International Space Station. That's really a remarkable achievement, if nothing, even obviously from an engineering point of view, but also from a political point of view, that these countries and nations that we came together and said, this is more important than us fighting over petty politics. So it's a remarkable time, and the ISS came out of that. It's research into how the human body reacts in zero gravity came out of that. But it's also taken a long time, and it's to no one's discredit. It's just the nature of a complex arrangement like that, and political entities, they are going to move slow. But now we have that kind of bedrock upon which to sit to start to think about humanity's next steps in space. What's the future for us? Colonization of orbit, colonization of the moon, of Mars. These things are all going to happen in our lifetime. And my goal in starting Orion Span was to start to make the first serious steps towards what we could, towards actually making these things a reality. So that's where the concept of Aurora Station came from.
So what happened? You grew up in the 70s, and throughout that whole era, the 60s to 70s, there was a massive space race and excitement. And suddenly today we're excited about getting a new iPhone, and kids don't really give a shit about doing anything big with their lives. What happened?
Well, actually, I think there's definitely a trend that people are more consumed with their gadgets and their electronics these days. But I think actually, at least in terms of space stuff, I actually think the reverse. I actually think the excitement today is bubbling more than it has been since the 70s, the heyday of the space race. And I think the reason for that is because of, again, I think you have to largely credit folks like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, that these people are rock stars in their field, and they achieve things that everybody said was impossible for private industry, and they achieve them, profitably. So I think that's why you start to sense a lot of excitement that these dreams of next step for humanity in space that were largely shelved after the 70s for some time are starting to come back. And not only they're starting to come back, they're coming back in a commercially viable way, which is really the most important part. Because anytime there is something supported solely by government funding, inevitably political winds will change, and you don't know what will happen with that funding as time goes on. So the only way to really sustain that kind of activity is the same way as it is on Earth. If you want to sustain a town, it's not going to, a government could sustain it, but that's not going to last forever. The way it really sustains itself is through economic activity and trading of goods and services, and movement of people in and out of that zone. So I think it's the same thing here. And I think that excitement is starting to bubble because people are sensing that that time is nearly at hand now. And I've certainly sensed it when we announced Aurora Station. I mean, we were in something like 1,500 media outlets in only a month. So the excitement has been off the charts.
Well, you're building a hotel in space. So the guys we referenced earlier, they were billionaires. So obviously they had some resources behind them to try the impossible. You are, someone who was somewhat successful, but for all intensive purposes, a nobody. What made you think that you could do this, and why have you guys been so successful to date? Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm not a billionaire. I'm not even a millionaire for that matter. But what I am is a entrepreneur who knows how to secure funding and do things extremely leanly. So if you think that to reach the point that we reached where we announced Aurora Station, the IP we generated, the patents, the technology, all the bits around that, we have a staff at the time of 5 people. Right? It's very, very lean. So do we need more staff? Of course, to go on with the project. But it's amazing what you can do when everybody's motivated and people are multi-talented. I mean, my marketing department is me. That's plus some PR folks. The guy who did the website, that was me, right? It's like this is a startup. We don't have the luxury of what larger companies do or better funded people do, where they can hire entire teams, which inevitably slows things down too, and then maybe produce something a little different. And it also means that we can take risks that nobody else can take because we are small, and that's kind of where we're at.
This is Eric Elise's lean startup model in a nutshell. When companies are able to move faster and break things, so to speak, they're able to go at much lower budgets. Thanks to technology and innovation from the iPhone and many other consumer tech products, space tech startups are now able to get started on a bootstrapped budget, bringing competitive prices much, much lower, making considerably more innovation for consumers, and overall improving the technology and performance significantly. This is going to be a very interesting era of space technology and where we're headed.
So in terms of why I'm coming at this or where I'm coming at this from is that, and this is to me the most exciting part, is that you no longer need to be a billionaire to have a successful space startup, and that's the central thesis of why I got into the business. Because you're right, if you're a billionaire, you can do anything because money is no object. But what's changing now is that there's enough interest in outside investment coming into the space business that it's possible to have companies operate off of venture capital. And that was one of the key theses for me, is that it's got to be possible to be venture funded, because otherwise you're just looking in a black hole of essentially philanthropy, right?
Or Space Force.
Yeah, exactly. It's that's not going to work commercially, right? It's got to be, if there's not a route for it to be venture fundable and for an investor to get a return, to think that they can get a return on their investment and eventually get that return, maybe it's a little longer tail, then we're not. Then if that is true, then they're not yet at the point where that activity is going to bloom. But I think what we've seen from other successful space startups, and a lot of them oriented around remote imaging, remote sensing, is that time is now at hand. You start to see them acquisitions. That means exits for investors. They get their money back plus, X number of multiples. So that's, I think, the difference between 10, 15 years ago when Musk and Bezos started and today, is that when those guys started, it was essentially philanthropy. And today it is something that is potentially a huge return for investors.
It is, but let's face it, I imagine that's not your driving force. And I know you need to say we want to return 1,000 times X for our venture investors. But let's be realistic. What is your driving force behind this, and how will you know when you've been successful?
Mm-hmm. Well, my driving force is obviously the mission of getting people into space and making that routine and getting to the point where we're building communities in space, right? That's the driving force. The funding vehicle for investors to get their return that's their angle, right? That they have to get a return, and that's how it has to operate, because otherwise there's no path for commercially viable entities to do this. So yeah, you're right. It's not exactly my angle. I'm not in this to personally get rich. I couldn't care less about being rich or not. My goal is to make these steps a reality and to actually get this thing going.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
So I know you're a little bit biased with this, but what do you see the future of space civilization, space life? Is it planets? Is it moons? Is it space stations? Is it orbitals? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, obviously, you can probably guess my perspective, but I think it's a little bit of all of those. I think the near term here is orbit. To me, is the next logical step in having people in space, and the reason is because it is the closest and safest of all space destinations. Right, in terms of actual time to get there, it takes about an hour to get there. It takes about 2 to 3 hours to return to the surface. So it's not that far. You've got the Earth's magnetic field to protect you. The dangers of going to and from are pretty well understood at this point. The risks to the body of being in zero gravity are pretty well understood at this point. So it's it's also the lowest cost in terms of energy. Delta V, the amount of impulse needed to reach low Earth orbit is lower than to reach anywhere else. So the costs are lower. So I think to me, that's the next logical step. And we certainly will see moon colonies, I'm confident, by the end of our lifetimes, and hopefully Mars colonies as well if Mr. Musk is successful. But if you think there's a part of the reason I started Aurora Station the way that I did is that I felt that the visionaries were looking farther ahead and leaving behind this gap here in orbit when that is actually the closest, lowest cost, relatively speaking, and safest of space destinations. When you're on the moon, when you're on Mars, you've got a lot more problems with radiation, with somebody has a medical emergency. Well, it's going to be if you're on the moon, it's going to be 3 days, 4 days till you can return. So the risks are a lot higher. And the same thing on Mars. I mean, essentially going to Mars is going to be a one-way ticket for the time being. So I think that we will see all these, but what we need here is for visionaries and governments that have the budget to do those inroads to places like the moon or Mars, and for the rest of the commercial business to start focusing on low Earth orbit as government starts to exit that and hand that over to industry.
So will the first installations, specifically the planetary or the moon-based ones, do you foresee that being government, private, or some combination thereof, or global?
Yeah, I kind of expect it'll probably be government for starters, because it's hard to make money going to the moon. If you want to establish a moon base, that's awesome, but how do you make that profitable? So that means either government or billionaires with enough billions that they can sustain that for some time.
What about like a planetary resources, but instead of mining asteroids, mining the moon, mining planets? Would that make sense? You know much more than I do, so I'm just striking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly a potential profit center, absolutely. But I think at least in the next few years, it's that those plans are probably, probably about 10 years out for that all to come to fruition, 5 to 10 years out, because it is all those things are feasible, but they have never yet been done. It doesn't mean they can't be done, doesn't mean they won't be done, but it means that it's probably going to take a little longer than anyone expects to figure out, and a mistake is costly. If you try to, say if you're either capturing an asteroid in orbit or you're mining on the moon, something goes wrong, it's not that easy to fix as it would be if we're mining here on Earth. Your machine gets stuck, your robot gets stuck. So those are all complexities that are added by the distance and not having manual hands to potentially fix something available at all times. What
does it look like in terms of tickets to go to Aurora Station? Where are you guys at with the process? What's the entirety look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're selling a 12-day trip, and the key here is that, and I think part of the reason we got so much attention was that what we're selling here is an experience rather than a room in a hotel. We've had the insight that for folks of high net worth individuals who can afford this, they can more or less afford all the material things in the world they want. But what is special is experiences that you can't beat. So this is like climbing Mount Everest, right? It's something exciting that you will never forget and will change your life forever. So the starting ticket prices are at $9.5 million to go up there for the 12-day trip. And we, as you've seen, we've gotten quite a few people on board already, signed up for it on the wait list. And there's more coming all the time. So it's been very exciting a couple months here.
When do you guys plan on getting a space station up there? And then what are the zoning requirements? I know it's challenging just to open a hotel on Earth. Take a second to think about the question here. Frank's answer will stun you. Want to just have this quick timeout so that you're able to really think about what your thoughts are on the future of space and then see what the realities are. But now let's get back to Frank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, actually, in some ways, it's ironically easier because those zoning requirements and hotel laws don't exist in space. So in some ways, that's actually easier. And obviously, in other ways, it's more complex because we've got some regulatory items like ITAR and the FAA to deal with. But those are quite manageable. It's really more that the process of getting up there is going to be, it's really more about the design and manufacture. We think we can have this thing built and launched by late 2021. And so we'll start taking guests then in early 2022 is the plan at the moment. And
you talked about it a little bit before, but the effects of low gravity on human beings. Can you just go over a little bit briefly what we've learned so far and then what the thoughts are on how that could potentially impact either hotel travelers or people in the future when we start to live further out?
Yeah, well, for hotel travelers, the good news is that a short stay like 12 days or even 30 or 60 days is not really going to affect you much. So that's the good news. But what we have seen is for folks like Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space, and other folks like that, some of the Russian astronauts as well, who spent extended times in zero gravity, is that there are effects like bone loss, there's effects on your cardiovascular system. People return to Earth and feel sick for some time. And this is a little bit the nature of being in zero gravity, is that your body, our bodies are adapted, very uniquely. We evolved and adapted to exactly what we have on Earth, right? The conditions on Earth, both gravity and oxygen and everything. So when that's taken away, there's elements in your body that just don't know what to do. Slip discs are more common in zero gravity. So a lot of kind of odd things like that. But the good news is, so short run, no effect. for in the long run, thinking ahead to colonization of orbit, my goal here is to, in the long run, is to have an amount of artificial gravity available, probably be between 0.6 to 0.8 G, which is research has shown is about the sweet spot, and gives you enough of that sensation of being on Earth that these effects don't kick in. So at that point, you've negated that problem. There are also medications you can take to counteract some of the effects. And what I've heard is that professional astronauts typically don't take those medications because they're afraid that they might get disqualified from flight in the future. But in our case, for hotel visitors, not a real problem. Long-term stays, potentially something we could evaluate until we're at a point that we do have a piece of infrastructure that's rotating and giving that simulated gravity to counteract some of these effects.
So simulated gravity being from rotation or from some other method? Okay.
Rotation.
Can you explain a little bit more for listeners who are interested how we could replicate gravity in space?
Yeah, sure. So the idea here, the easiest way today to essentially emulate gravity in open space, so not on the moon or Mars where you have some amount of gravity thanks to those being pretty large planetary bodies, but in open space or in orbit where it's zero gravity, the easiest way to do this today is to spin a structure. So the same way back here on Earth, if you're in a merry-go-round or a Ferris wheel, you've probably felt the effect of being pushed out as you're spinning around that merry-go-round. So the same concept in a space structure. You can rotate it at a speed to get some amount of effectively gravity. And while you're spinning, picture yourself standing at the end of that spin, if that makes sense. So then you're kind of being pushed down and out, and you can simulate any amount of gravity depending on the rotational velocity. So there's a lot of pretty cool concepts out there for how this might be done. And most concepts tend to be really, really large and expensive structures. When we do get to that point in the mid to late 2020s that we start to go down that route, our plan is to make this as simple as possible and as safe as possible. Because if the more that we can keep it simple and reduce that cost, the more likely it is that we can have people up there regularly.
How much of the inspiration for these type of designs and then just the type of future thinking necessary to create businesses like this is driven by sci-fi?
I think a good bit. I think sci-fi. There's sci-fi in many ways. I think inspires a lot of creativity. If you look back at old Star Trek episodes or even Star Wars, a lot of those technologies that you see there start to come to fruition. Like Star Trek Next Generation had early versions of the iPad, and Star Wars had all sorts of stuff too. So I think there's absolutely these are ideas that people come up with, and science fiction writers are great at the creativity there. And then it's up to engineers and business folks to figure out how to if it's actually possible to make it in some form, and then secondly sell it, because that's in the space business, you always want to make sure you're actually able to sell what you're building. What would
be some of your favorite or most influential writers, books, pieces, etc., either from now or growing up?
I think I was kind of more of a liberal arts guy, actually. So I read a lot of classic literature, and I think probably influential for me growing up was indeed some of those classics. Like I remember reading the Odyssey and some of those bits when I was a kid, and I remember that what struck me when reading the classics, and it wasn't just the Odyssey, but what struck me then was that the kind of universal search for meaning across thousands of years of human existence. Even in these classics, you saw characters yearning to understand what their purpose was and why they were here, or if it was something like the Book of Job, why was God punishing Job? So that kind of yearning to understand and determine why are we here, or why are things happening to me or not happening to me or to us.
I know what you're thinking, AI, and we'll get there. One sec. But first, today's episode and all of Fringe FM is brought to you 100% ad-free by the folks at Fringe FM. We put in a lot of effort into every episode to try to improve the world and to make your life at least a little bit better. If you like what we're doing, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can go to fringe.fm/Patreon to support us there and help us to create more great content like this and to try our best to change the world at least a little bit. But now let's get back to Frank and his thoughts on AI in the future of space.
I think those things I found a universal thread, and you can see it in all literature through today. Even it tends to be today good movies. If you look at the best movies and the best television series, they often also have these same components of a yearning to understand why we're here, concept of destiny, and trying to figure out what the deeper meaning is of things. So I think that's probably the one thing that I've taken away through my life is feeling that all human beings seek to have a greater understanding of our place in the world. And I think that applies whether you're a religious person or not, and whatever ethnicity you are. I don't think it matters. And men or women, I think it's universal across all people.
It definitely is. Would you call yourself a philosopher?
Yeah, I guess in some ways I am. I certainly read a lot of philosophy when I was younger.
How has that impacted you to date?
Mostly it's made me more thoughtful. And I've also kind of half jokingly decided that I want my son to be a philosopher, but we'll see if that comes to fruition or not.
Well, it's not like memorizing facts will be very useful for very long.
Yeah, apparently not. But philosophy is something that, unfortunately, it's largely in the modern era kind of not an interesting profession. But historically, philosophers were sought after as keepers of wisdom and people who thought deeply about life and meaning and is the world even real? Those kinds of concepts, right? Like Matrix or Inception. Those kinds of themes are exploited in those movies. But today it's a little bit on the down and out.
I think we'll move a bit back towards that because as we do get to more of a futuristic world where a lot of things are taken care of, the value becomes asking the question, not necessarily trying to find the answer. Mm-hmm. How does artificial intelligence play into what you're doing today? And what are some of the implications you see?
It's a strong component because if you think back to the era of when the ISS was being first planned in the 70s and early 80s, so it was intended to be many things, including manufacturing, storage depot, fuel depot, space laboratory. So it had many roles in mind, but as the political and budgetary winds blew, it eventually got cut back to really being a space laboratory more than anything.
It's very, very hard to coordinate incentives between groups, political entities, etc. This is part of the reason why, if you look towards sci-fi and towards what we can foresee as the future of humanity, there's the concept of a type 1 civilization, or a civilization where all government or all of a planet has come under one leadership so that we're able to more effectively utilize resources needed to become an interplanetary species. It doesn't really happen when there's squabbling and fighting between different governments or organizations on who gets to control or who puts budget in or who is in charge of, etc., etc. Those are some of the implications, and we'll be seeing much more of this as the space race, the second space race, the greatest space race ever, starts to unfold.
So if you think to that time in the 70s and 80s, robots and the capabilities of machines to assist humans were pretty limited. Machines tended to be huge. Computing power was limited. You'd have to have something the size of a room that now fits in the size of your pocket. So when the creators of the ISS were envisioning these huge human communities and workers in space. But I think, with the reality of advancing computer power and development of AI, and I just saw a news bit this morning about Google Duplex and how uncannily good the conversational abilities are. These technologies are all coming along, and we're not far away from having a really an effective AI, from being able to augment human capabilities. So I think it's a key piece in all space exploration. So not solely as so for sure as a vanguard to go ahead and check safety or do measurements, check radiation, see if it's a place is safe for human life to go. So there's certainly that component. I think even more broadly speaking, take a movie like Interstellar, right, where Matthew McConaughey's character was assisted by the robot, I forgot his name, or several robots rather. So I think that's kind of that kind of science fiction envisionment is the reality we're heading towards very soon. And it also means a couple of things. It means less risk to human life, more capability for individuals to do things, whatever it is that they're trying to do, if they're traveling or if they're building something. And it also means that we're essentially sharing that future together with this AI as it grows. It's certainly very exciting and in some ways maybe mildly concerning. I'm sure you've probably heard of Elon Musk's concern that AI is going to try to kill us one day. And so I think it's definitely a valid concern that we have to be careful of, that the kind of the roots of programming and development of this technology is designed in such a way that it should not harm people under any circumstance. Because, you think back historically, anytime there has been a clash of civilizations over a resource, say land or something else, there's usually been a conflict, and usually that conflict didn't end well for the party that was less advanced technologically. So I think it's a valid concern. But that said, unlike the historical case where you had no control over the parties who were meeting each other, here we have the ability to control and design that AI from the ground up to essentially augment human capabilities and not be in competition with human capabilities.
Sort of, but that's like saying, can you keep something in a box that's a bajillion times smarter than you. I use bajillion because we have no idea exactly what that multiplier is.
Yep. It's a valid concern. It is absolutely a valid concern.
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
Just in case, we don't know if the killer AI is coming, if we're going to a Hal type scenario, but we need to set up lots of space hotels and protect ourselves by having a backup plan.
That's certainly that's also certainly a valid argument. That's that's one of the reasons that I know Elon Musk talks about going to Mars is for preserving humanity should things go wrong here on Earth.
What are your thoughts about that strategy?
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, in the long term, long term, billions of years is that Earth is not going to be around forever. Neither is Mars. In the long term, we have to be an interstellar civilization. And I think it's also a valid concern that the Fermi paradox, right? The concept that why are we so far, to the best of our knowledge, the only civilization, the only advanced civilization in the universe, to the best of our capabilities, understanding. It is unsettling. Is it because something is coming ahead of us that's going to kill us, or is it because the properties of our civilization are so unique and nobody knows, and nobody's going to know anytime soon? So it's you kind of have to keep a watchful eye out on what are the most threatening items today. The most horrible weapons in the world, they can tremendously disrupt life, but they probably could not fully end all life on Earth easily. But you think ahead 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, I'm sure we will develop more terrible weapons. Maybe they can wipe out an entire planet. So you have to kind of thinking down the road that there's certainly I'm generally an optimist, but you do have to think that how would these technologies be used also as a weapon potentially, or used for ill.
Yeah, bioweapons, CRISPR, nukes, or a fusion reactor. There's a lot of potentials there, and at the same time, there's a lot of potential progress. That's part of the reason we run Fringe FM is to try to bring on the innovators, the people that are transforming the world, like you. But what I also like to bring up with people is everyone's got their passion projects. It's what they're focused on. It's their specialty. But at the same time, you're plugged in with some of the smartest minds around. So what other industries outside of space and AI are you most interested or fascinated with?
So for me personally, so before I came to the space business, I've been in the software automation world, and that's an area I'm very interested in. It kind of ties in a lot to AI, obviously. I'm also quite keen on, more broadly in the aerospace industry, anything related to flight. So whether it's launch or even some of the exciting work that, say, like a startup like Boom is doing, creating the next generation supersonic airliner. I think those are all exciting things because it's, the faster people can move around the globe, and the sooner that technology comes, the sooner that capability arises, and the longer it's around and prices go down. That's a net good for all people. So I'm excited about all that. And something like CRISPR that you mentioned is also something that's extremely exciting because it has potential to fundamentally alter the dynamics of who we are and make ourselves essentially programmable like a computer. And so there's a lot of ethical challenges, a lot of both excitement and potentials of good uses, but also ethical concerns. And what, at some point you kind of start to wonder, what does it actually mean to be a human being if we can just change ourselves in fundamental ways like that? So those are some of the areas I'm broadly interested in, but I have to admit, I'm kind of a general, just information geek. Anything that's technical, I tend to read up about just because I'm curious.
Curiosity did not actually kill the cat.
I hope not.
Just got quite distracted. So making babies in space, do we need to genetically alter people to be able to live in or reproduce in space?
No. I mean, you could go down that route, but I'm of the firm belief that no, you do not need to. It's certainly in orbit where you've got the protection of the magnetic field, we're in pretty good shape. When you start to talk about deep space missions and you have radiation exposure, things get more complex. These are challenges that we need to deal with. If we need to have X inches of lead or other material shielding. Let's innovate to either find ways to create shielding that doesn't require so much mass to be sent into orbit, into space. Or for that matter, let's start to think about resource capture, like planetary resources. Can we mine resources from asteroids or from the moon to build that stuff in space so we don't have to launch heavy shielding into space? So I'm of the firm belief that no, we don't need to. But that said, I know that I also believe that it is coming, whether anyone likes it or not.
So realistically, will we start to split off into different species before or after we become interplanetary?
I don't think we'll really split off, because if we're really interplanetary and successfully interplanetary, so meaning that the interplanetary, say if we have a settlement on the moon or Mars, so for starters, those colonies will be highly dependent on either Earth resources or orbital resources. And as they become self-sufficient, at that point, technology has become so good that the ability to travel back and forth will become a lot easier. So actually, I kind of view it as an extension of globalization, where travel becomes cheaper and people move around more rather than less.
But if you grow up on a 0.6G planet and I grow up on a 2G planet, gravity being how I'm going to be short and super powerful and you're going to be pretty tall and be jumping like Michael Jordan. Well,
I mean, yeah, I guess that's theoretically possible. I'm thinking more that if people wanted to, say if you want to raise your kid on Mars, there are going to be different dynamics. And if that person spends a good part of their lives there and the next generations are there, so thinking way down the road, there might be some differences for sure. But if you also imagine that at that point, travel is so easy that you could choose to, if you were on Mars and you wanted to have a child, you could travel to Earth and have it here too, right? Where everything is understood and that's what we're evolved for. But certainly, if you start to think about that in the long run, like hundreds of years and thousands of years, there would start to be genetic variations inevitably as life got more adapted to dealing with different gravity conditions.
And that's only from the pure normal evolution standpoint. That's not taking into account editing.
I'm talking purely normal. I'm talking purely normal evolution. Yeah, if we wanted to augment that with our own capabilities, which we certainly could then, we pretty much can now, to make it more friendly to somebody living in that world, we certainly could. But if you imagine that we are in that state, if that were right now today, you could also argue the reverse, that, well, then you can also change things around that you can basically precondition them for IVF for any scenario. So you could say then that, well, people will split off regardless, because there's become a kind of a shotgun blast of genetic variation as people start to pursue different traits.
Yeah, it's a very interesting future. So I want to transition a little bit into you personally. So what were you doing before you started Orion?
Sure. I was a vice president of a company called UpGuard, which was focused on the software automation realm and also cybersecurity.
And then you decided to jump into Orion because you had always been into space, and suddenly the iPhone and new technology had made things much cheaper?
Well, I've been watching the space business for probably about 5 years prior to that already. I've been watching it for a long time. And there's certainly, I've been kind of watching what people were doing and how they were doing it, and also watching what people were doing around the launch business. So the two areas that interested me most were launch and basically orbital platform, what we're doing. And what I saw around launch was that there were quite a few players involved already, and more coming online every day. And everybody claims their method of getting to orbit will be cheaper, better, faster. So what I also saw was that the capital costs were higher for launch versus doing something in orbit. So I started to look more at the orbital side of things, where it's actually overall less complex, because you don't have to deal with the stresses and the pressures of tremendous speed in the atmosphere and getting to orbit. Once you're in orbit, it's you're there and you're traveling at a speed, traveling 20,000 miles per hour in LEO. But you don't have to worry about the process of getting to that speed, accelerating to it. So what I saw is that with a little bit of innovation and creativity, that we could bring down the cost of operating a space station in LEO by huge margins, and versus what other people are doing, what other people are proposing. And if you think of these two sides of the equation, both launch and platforms in space, the reason they both interested me is because I believe that both need to be effectively there to start thinking about the next steps of people living in space, colonizing space. You need to have cheap, reliable, safe launch capability, and you need to have cheap, reliable, safe destinations in space. And what we have seen to date is that there is no private destination space, solely the ISS. And it is it's funded by the various ISS partners, and many of those partners, not just the US, are getting itchy about getting out of it because it costs every agency a tremendous amount of money.
And none of them agree on absolutely anything. So who are you booking a ride with? I know with space, it's a lot like Uber, and you can hop on whoever as long as you got the cash.
Yeah, it is kind of like that. Actually, it's definitely a money-driven environment, which is a good thing. So we're still in the evaluating phases of which partners, but we're looking at the folks in the world like Blue Origin, SpaceX, those types of players, and we're also looking at some national space agencies like the Japanese Space Agency, and then also looking at some smaller launch providers that might be able to provide resupply missions in the future as well.
What kind of scale do we need to get to for you guys, or in general, to make something like this a high scale resort type thing? So $1,000 a night as opposed to $792,000.
Yeah, I think that the key piece here is, so our costs are we've designed and innovated in ways that our costs are relatively low. Our biggest upfront cost is going to be the engineering build out, the staff needed to do the full engineering design. Once we've designed and once we've manufactured one of these modules, they're all going to be the same. That's the whole principle behind Orion Span, is that it's one of the key operating principles is keep it simple. And by having the same spacecraft over and over, it makes all other operations easier by extension and lower cost. So our cost to produce another spacecraft is relatively low, but the biggest cost in all this equation is launch, of course. Our analysis and estimates show that costs of launching a human into space will be in the low to mid millions by early 2020s. But if you really want this cost to come down to $1,000 a night, like you said, that means that the price of access to space has to come way, way, way down from what it is today. And I think $1,000 a night we're probably talking 15, 20 years away. We need much, much more advanced technologies to get to space that just don't exist today.
So it's not just scale; it's also a technology problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the reusability factors that are driving SpaceX's success, you still have costs, high marginal costs of fuel and so forth. So until somebody figures out a way of getting to space much, much more cheaply, and for humans specifically to get to space much more cheaply, then that's going to be a challenge.
What about a train versus like a taxi approach where you're taking 10,000 people up?
Yeah, that would be great. But obviously to build infrastructure of that scale would require a tremendous amount of capital. And that's something that, at least to make this a venture fundable and rapidly profitable business, would not be possible. That might be possible for someone like Jeff Bezos, who has billions to spare. But for regular folks and even low-end billionaires, it wouldn't be possible.
What would you like to see the government do, and the governments around the world specifically, to make space exciting for the future?
Well, I think it's naturally exciting to a lot of people, but I think what we really need to see, and we've started to see it slowly here in the U.S. now, is regulatory reform. A lot of the early laws and concepts around space were created in the 60s and 70s when the space race was still afoot, and some of them are not relevant anymore. So I think we really need to see that there's been some serious steps towards that. It started here in the U.S. It's abroad. It's also starting to gain some steam. But I think we also need to continue to take the work of the political work done by the teams that created the ISS, the framework of the ISS. So those various, these are, again, nations that were, prior to that time, were killing each other not long ago. So I think we need to continue to have that shared spirit, that space is a shared space for all of us to use, and we should continue to pursue its use peacefully as much as possible, because this is not something that you want to have people have orbital missile platforms. There's a whole reason that the International Space Treaty was signed, is nobody wants that, because it makes the world less safe. So I think we need to have that continued shared spirit that space is our destiny as a civilization, but it's also I want to stop using the word space, but I'm having trouble with it. It's also a space that we should exploit peacefully and work together to get to, rather than resource contention, where somebody goes, sooner or later, this has probably happened, but somebody goes to the moon and says, this area on the moon belongs to me, or to my nation, or to my company. And I think that kind of thinking is just, it's it's dated at this point. We are all on the same team. We are one civilization. And I think we need to continue to behave that way. And the precedent of the ISS set a strong one that I think we need to maintain.
We are and we aren't one civilization. Are you implying that we need to get to the point where we have one world government or decentralized type body to be able to be successful as a type 1 civilization and scale?
No, not necessarily. No, I don't think it would necessarily make sense. I think more that in the sense that the agreements that govern the use of space and planetary bodies need to be aligned in the same direction. There's always going to be bickering and political stuff that you can't avoid that, but to be able to reach some sort of consensus and reach it more frequently. So a lot of these agreements were reached in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So that time, we should be reevaluating those every 5 or 10 years because times change quickly, especially with all the new technology. So I think we need to be able to have those discussions more frequently and update those laws and agreements as we continue to evolve and get into space more.
I can absolutely agree with that. Amen. Where are you contrarian? What do you believe that others around you disbelieve?
I think I'm the biggest contrarian in thinking that this is all starting to align in the next few years. What I hear out there is there's certainly a lot of enthusiasm, but if you look at some of the comment threads about us in the media, there's a lot of doubt. And, I totally get it. It's nobody wants to be let down, and it's always easier to imagine that things aren't going to work than that they might. So I think the area where I'm the biggest contrarian is that I sincerely believe, and I sincerely know, actually, for that matter, I don't just believe, I know because I've been through it, that there are ways to do this and they don't have to cost enormous sums of money. And that means that we can start to get people up there more cheaply than I've ever done before.
And now the absolute most important question. What ticket number will you be in line, and when do you get to get up there?
I haven't reserved one for myself yet, but what I'll probably do is, I have given this some thought, what I'll probably do is take because I expect on the wait list, not everybody will end up taking their spot. But what I'll probably do is take a spot in the wait list somewhere in the first year of somebody who gives up their spot for whatever reason. But that said, the early flights, we're going to need that revenue. We need to, prove the business model. We need the revenue to operate. So I certainly won't be taking it on the first few flights.
So basically, you're going to be super, super jealous.
Yes, exactly. But I wouldn't say jealous, but honestly, I'm going to be excited more than anything because it's not just if you think about it's a little bit like, in a way, raising a kid, where the people that go on their first few flights are going to be international heroes and all over the news and the media. And I'm excited what potential that brings because, I don't yet know what they will want to draw attention to. Maybe they just want to enjoy the spotlight. Maybe they want to draw attention to a cause that they're passionate about, or maybe they want to draw attention to their business. So I think more than anything, I'm just excited to see the creativity that people come up with. And I expect there'll be some entrepreneurial spirit there that we haven't thought of. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
And by the time you've launched, you'll have the world's easiest time raising money because you're having ultra high net worth individuals signing up on year-long waiting lists to be able to get into your hotel. You can franchise that big time.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be very interesting. Frank, I know you're a super busy guy. You've got a lot going on. One last question for you before we start to wrap things up. And that is, what is one thing you would like to leave the audience with? A challenge, something you'd like them to look into or thereabouts? I'd like to challenge the audience to think of what we're doing at Orion Span as a call to action rather than this is what we're doing and it's a block. The key to making colonization of space possible is to make it more low cost. So what I want out of Orion Span and what I want to challenge people is to view it as a challenge to lower access costs to space. The only way that we're really going to get seriously into space and colonize space, wherever it is, whether it's Moon, Mars, elsewhere, orbit, is to make it more affordable. It's got to be affordable to eventually to the average person. And today that is far, far off. So I would challenge everybody out there who has dreams and has a passion to take a chance and find a way to make it better. Because there's always a way to make it better. People are going to pick on you. People are going to laugh at you. People are going to walk away from you. Same thing that's happened to me. But there is a way. You just gotta keep at it and find what it is. Absolutely. And to add to that, it takes about the same amount of effort to do 10 times the results as it does to just do the thing itself. So my flip on for you, Frank, is what is your 10X challenge? When will you have 10 of these hotels in there? I want you to hold yourself accountable to this. 10? That's going to be a ways off. We're probably talking about the 2030s for 10. 2030s? Okay. So how about we say 2027 and call it a deal?
I think I'll stick with 2030s, 2027s.
2030s, not a problem.
Take a lot of time.
Frank, thanks for coming on. Where's the best place for people to reach out and say hey?
Yeah, sure. So feel free. There's a generic email we have. You can reach out to us, greetings@Orion Span, and feel free to also reach out to me directly. My direct email is frank.bunger@Orion Span. Always look forward to comments and discussions. So please feel free to say hi.
Yeah, guys, say hi. And if you have tons of money, book a ticket. Thanks for coming on, Frank. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Take care.
And hope you guys have enjoyed this. We'll be headed to space soon. Cheers. If you want more of Fringe FM, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or go to fringe.fm, where you'll find tons of audio and video interviews with leaders in the fields of genetics, cryptocurrency, longevity, AI, space, VR, and much, much more. And you can follow me on Twitter @It'sMattWard. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a quick review in iTunes to help more people discover Fringe FM.